Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stown. There are state laws in Florida banning gender-affirming medical care for minors and restricting health care for transgender adults. In September, a prison policy was implemented that is impacting treatment of inmates diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the distress that results from someone's biological sex at birth not aligning with their gender identity. Beth Schwartzapfel uncovered the new policy in her reporting at the Marshall Project. That's a nonprofit organization covering the criminal justice system. She joined Engage to explain why the restrictions are being compared to conversion therapy by transgender inmates she interviewed.
Up till this point, the state provided some very basic accommodations for people with gender dysphoria. Hormone treatment, transgender women in men's prisons had to have special passes to wear their hair long, had to have special passes to wear bras and women's underwear, some very basic, simple accommodations like that. Well, as of September 30th, all of that was being rescinded. From that point forward, the state told the trans people in the prisons that the first line treatment, and indeed pretty much the only treatment for gender dysphoria from here on out, was psychotherapy. So they were no longer going to be allowed to wear their hair long. They were no longer going to be allowed to have women's undergarments. They were no longer going to be allowed to have access to canteen items that are considered, quote, women's canteen items, such as makeup, scented shampoos, things like that. So the only way that women were allowed to keep their bras is if a doctor deemed it medically necessary. And so that's where these breast exams came in. Any transgender woman in the state's prisons who wanted to keep her bra had to go to a doctor, lift up her shirt, and the doctor would glance at her breasts and write a number down. And they use this staging system called the Tanner system, which is what they use, pediatricians use to gauge, adolescent puberty. And the trans women that I spoke to got mixed messages. Some said they were told that people who were a certain Tanner stage got to keep their bra. Others said they didn't know anybody who got to keep their bra except for women who had breast implants and clearly could not safely not have them. But the end result was all these women feeling, deeply humiliated and ashamed by these sort of visual exams, and then losing their bra in the end anyway.
How were the trans inmates you were speaking to informed about the policy?
So I know there are only a small handful of prisons in Florida, men's prisons, that actually house trans women, 3 or 4 of them. And in at least the 2 of them where I spoke to folks, there was a big meeting where they sort of herded all the trans women into a room. In one of the prisons, actually, they had guards with guns, very, very unusual presence of, top administrators, and basically said to them, everything's changing now. You're going to lose your gender dysphoria diagnosis. You're all going to be reevaluated. You have 30 days to cut your hair, to get rid of your canteen items, and to turn in your undergarments. Otherwise, that all becomes contraband and you could be subject to discipline. And they were asked to sign this piece of paper, basically acknowledging that they understood these new rules. But to a person, everybody I spoke to said, I barely even got a chance to look at the piece of paper, and I really wasn't given the option to not sign it. A few people wrote under duress after they signed it. One woman told me she put an X on the paper because she didn't feel like she wanted to put her name to it, as if she had actually had a chance to read it and as if she agreed to it.
Just to make sure I'm understanding for clarity, when we're talking about this, these policies that were changing in late September, who was tasked with drafting them under the new state laws?
So there was a lot of confusion when the new state law passed, SB 254, which mostly got attention for banning gender-affirming care for young people, also contained a provision that said that the state couldn't expend state funds on, and this is a quote, sex reassignment prescriptions or procedures. And so there was not an obvious or immediate change, except that things in the prison, medications and things in the prison sort of started to fall into disarray. At the time, trans women were telling me that suddenly their medications weren't being refilled, or they were told that, they were no longer allowed to have access to hormones in one form, but they had to have them administered only in another form. But nobody had any really clear explanation of what exactly was happening or why. So meantime, we come to find out in the course of some litigation that the ACLU filed that all this time, the state prison system's medical director was in the process of drafting these new rules. His name is Danny Martinez, and he wrote in these new rules that he drafted that transgender people may not actually, in fact, be transgender, and then, in fact, their gender dysphoria may be misdiagnosed, or they may be experiencing short-term delusions or beliefs which may later be changed and reversed. So that language is in the document that he wrote and is part of the rationale for now refusing to provide, what is otherwise the standard of care for gender-affirming care for trans people in Florida prisons.
So you've spoken to transgender inmates, including people in Central Florida, who describe this as something like conversion therapy, harkening back to the days when transgenderism and homosexuality were regarded as something of a mental illness.
Yes, that's right. What the policy puts front and center for treatment of gender dysphoria is psychotherapy. And, I want to be clear, most people who are experts in treatment of people with gender dysphoria would say, of course, psychotherapy is important. Nobody's trying to say that you don't need therapy if you, are struggling with your gender identity. But what the state of Florida does is say, first of all, that, a trans identity might be a short-term delusion. And so pairing that with requiring psychotherapy certainly makes it sound like they're expecting to, quote unquote, cure somebody. Not to mention that, as several experts I talked to said, we have an effective treatment for gender dysphoria, and that's hormone therapy, surgery as needed, social transition like clothing and hair. And so to say we will only provide psychotherapy and not these other treatments that have been shown to be extremely effective is essentially the same as saying, we want to cure your gender dysphoria rather than treat it. And, conversion therapy is widely debunked as ineffective and harmful. And so the state is essentially saying we're going to use this ineffective and harmful treatment when we have an effective treatment that we refuse to use.
Okay, and that ACLU suit that you mentioned, yesterday a federal judge in Tallahassee held a preliminary hearing. So what is the ACLU's argument and what happened in the proceedings?
So basically, several judges, including a federal judge in Florida, have ruled that to deny people gender affirming care when they really need it. And I just want to be clear, not all trans people need or want things like hormones or other medical interventions. But for those who do need it, for those whose, well-being depends on it, to deny it violates the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. It's cruel, essentially, and therefore unconstitutional. And states can't issue a blanket ban on any kind of treatment. This has come up in lots of instances. Like, for instance, some states have refused to pay for hepatitis C treatment because it's too expensive. Well, that's a blanket ban. You can't do that. You have to make medical decisions based on what's best for each individual patient. And so what the ACLU is arguing is that this is essentially a blanket ban. They're saying we will not provide hormones. And the new policy says unless the Constitution or a judgment requires us to, which is, again, really vague. Who decides what the Constitution requires? So the ACLU is saying this new policy violates the Eighth Amendment. This new policy essentially amounts to denying people medical care, which is cruel and unusual punishment. The state says, no, it's not. It's individualized care. The language that the state used in court was that it was a carefully crafted policy that creates an individualized course of treatment for each inmate based on scientific evidence and clinical judgment. So the two things that they were arguing about at this hearing the other day, and this was just a preliminary hearing, the judge wasn't really considering the merits per se, but what they were arguing about was the state said, look, you don't even have a case. This is on its face individualized treatment. We're entitled to craft rules according to the law. Your Honor, you need to just dismiss this case altogether. The ACLU, on the other hand, was arguing this is an emergency. Our clients are in imminent danger of very serious harm. And, Your Honor, you need to stop this policy from going into effect immediately. And so the two sides kind of made their case on those two issues, and the judge took those under consideration and said he would issue a ruling, sometime soon.
In your reporting, have you gotten a response from the Florida Department of Corrections specifically?
The Florida Department of Corrections seems to have taken a position towards my reporting that they're going to ignore me. I don't know how they treat other reporters, but I have never honestly encountered a Department of Corrections. And I report on prisons. That is my full-time job. So I deal with departments of corrections all over the country all the time. And I can't say I've ever encountered a Department of Corrections that just blatantly ignores me. I send them emails after emails after emails. I make phone calls. We partnered with the Tampa Bay Times on this and another previous story about treatment of trans people in Florida's prisons. And one of their reporters actually went to the State House and found a Department of Corrections official and said, "Hey, we've been trying to reach you." And they said, "Oh, we'll get back to you," and then never did. I mean, we went to great lengths to try to get the state to sort of weigh in on their point of view here, and they seem to go to great lengths to not answer me. So I can't say, except for what they've said in court papers, what their rationale is or what their plan is.
Following yesterday's preliminary hearing, what's next for this case?
So the next thing that everybody's waiting for is for the judge to rule on these early motions. The motion for the emergency injunction on the ACLU side, asking the judge to emergently prevent the department from enforcing these rules, and the state's motion to dismiss the case on the other side. So that's going to be the next step, is the judge will rule on those. And then, assuming the case goes forward, then at some point the judge will actually hear the case on the merits itself about whether this new policy is unconstitutional or not.
And I want to go back to the transgender inmates impacted. You have spoken to trans inmates, including those people in the Central Florida area. Is there any relief options for these inmates in the immediate future?
The one thing that they have still is their hormones. And this is a little bit of a confusing stance to be in, because the state has said that they plan to reevaluate everybody and decide whether they get to stay on their hormones, but those reevaluations have not happened yet. And so a lot of the women describe feeling like this is sort of hanging over their head, like they get to keep their medicines for now, but they don't know for how long, and they certainly don't trust that the state will make an honest assessment. In the meantime, having lost all these other accommodations, they're in this really terrible position where a trans woman who's been on women's hormones for years has breasts, but they're not allowed to have a bra. And so many of these women are walking around feeling really exposed. They're in a men's prison, which is already really dangerous. They've had their head shaved. One woman said that she feels like a hideous boy with tits. And I apologize if that's a little bit crass, but they're in this position where they're not allowed to wear the clothes that they feel comfortable wearing, wear their hair how they feel comfortable wearing it, but they are allowed to stay on their medicine. So they're just backed into this really terrible corner. And, a lot of people fear that that's kind of what's coming for the rest of the country. I mean, the Supreme Court held hearings just last week on a ban against gender affirming care for young people in Tennessee. And not to get too far afield, but if the Supreme Court sides with Tennessee in that case, states will be free to pass laws like this, not just for people in prison, but for anyone.
Beth Schwartzoffel is a reporter at the Marshall Project, a nonprofit organization covering the criminal justice system. There's more ahead here on Engage. We'll look at the impact of the incoming administration on the future of NASA's programs and missions happening from our Space Coast. We're streaming live now at cfpublic.org. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, Belsnickel is more than a Dwight Schrute-inspired gag from The Office, and his portrayal is more accurate than you know.
He's bearded. He's kind of like this old fellow with that dirty face, and his clothes are tattered. And He carries like a sacklet slung over his shoulder, and he has a switch in his hand.
We will learn about figures from Christmas folklore like St. Nick, Krampus, and Belsnickel with UCF's Natalie Underberg-Good. First, though, Central Floridians can frequently look up and watch the bright lights trailing in the sky from the rocket launches that originated from our Space Coast. Cape Canaveral is home to one of NASA's major field centers and their main launch site at the Kennedy Space Center. Our region is a hub for the future of space exploration. There are questions now about what that future could look like under a new administration. We're joined now by Central Florida Public Media's Assistant News Director and host of the podcast, Are We There Yet?, Brendan Byrne. Thank you for joining us, Brendan. I know you're following some significant developments that could have some really big implications for our Space Coast and space flight in general. Let me start by asking you with what you learned about NASA's latest plans for sending people back to the moon.
Yeah, so we got an update from now NASA's outgoing administrator, now Bill Nelson. And just taking a quick step back, the Artemis program is NASA's plans to return humans to the moon. This is the first time in more than a half century, right? The last time humans have been to the moon is 1972. This program has been long over budget and long delayed since coming to fruition, but it did have a successful launch of an uncrewed mission, the Orion space capsule. But there were some things that showed up on that particular mission that caused NASA and the engineers to take a pause and look a little bit deeper, and that involved the Orion's heat shield. So that delayed the mission. So this is what NASA Administrator Bill Nelson had to say when talking to reporters earlier this month about what is to come with the program.
Space is demanding, and we and our industry and international partners need this time to make sure that the Orion capsule is ready to safely deliver our astronauts to deep space and back to Earth.
So here's what we know. Artemis 2 mission is the first human mission that is going to launch around the moon and then come back to Earth safely. In the first mission, Artemis 1, which was uncrewed, there was some anomalies that showed up on the heat shield. The capsule that is going to carry these astronauts reaches intense heat as it punches through the atmosphere because of how fast it's going. These are temperatures of up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a lot. And what they found was the heat shield was charring as it's supposed to do, but bits of that charring on this uncrewed mission had actually come off. So there was a very lengthy investigation into why the heat shield was reacting this way, which delayed the next human mission. What they found was what happens in order to disperse some of this heat, the vehicle actually dips in and out of the atmosphere to kind of control the amount of heat. But apparently the amount of time that it's spent doing that is what caused the issue. So what they're going to do for this crewed mission is just spend less time inside the atmosphere during these high temperatures. With that investigation, though, we were looking for a launch of that crew in late 2025. Now we're going to be looking at no earlier than April 26th. That also delays the first human landing on the moon to mid-2027. So as I mentioned before, this is just going to go around the moon and back, prove that the life support systems are working and are safe, and they pave the way for the third mission in the Artemis program, which will launch humans on the moon. So because of this one heat shield issue, we're starting to see these domino effects that change the schedule there.
And as we look forward into the years ahead, Brendan, any sense of what private-public partnerships could look like moving forward with these commercial companies involved in space exploration?
Let me start with Artemis. Artemis, by design, leverages commercial space companies, right? So the rocket, the SLS rocket, it's built by commercial partners like Boeing. Lockheed Martin is the Orion capsule that carries these astronauts, and even the landing systems that are going to bring astronauts to the surface are built by commercial companies, right? SpaceX is using an iteration of its Starship that's currently under development now to bring the first set of humans down. Blue Origin, which is the private space company run by Jeff Bezos, they also will have a moon lander that will be in the Artemis architecture moving forward. So this is a very private and commercially focused landing on the moon. It's run by NASA, but a lot of these companies are doing it. A lot of the support systems that go into us living and working on the moon in the future, and even these Artemis missions, paving the way for humans to land on the moon, are also done by commercial partners. They love their acronyms. The program's called CLPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, which is essentially vehicles that are built by private companies, that are launched by private companies, that go to the moon carrying NASA payloads. So a lot of these things are going into determining where Artemis astronauts are going to land. So there is a very, very large commercial footprint when it comes to our future moon endeavors. And as you also know, Sharon, a lot of the stuff, even before getting to the moon, going to the International Space Station, is run by commercial partners, right? SpaceX ferries astronauts to and from the space station. Boeing is trying to with its Starliner capsule. So there is a lot of private partnerships with NASA. And we anticipate that a lot of this will continue through the Trump administration because a lot of this did happen under the first Trump administration.
This leads me on to my next question. What do we know about the man who could replace former astronaut Bill Nelson as NASA administrator under this new administration next year?
Yeah, so President-elect Trump has nominated Jared Isaacman to be the next NASA administrator. Jared Isaacman is a billionaire who made his fortunes in the payment processing industry, but has always really had a special place in his heart for space travel. He was the one who bankrolled the first all-civilian space mission, Inspiration 4, that was focused on raising money for St. Jude. That launched from Kennedy Space Center in a SpaceX capsule. He recently, we talked about him on your show not too long ago, from doing the first commercial spacewalk in a recent mission that launched. And that was also one that he bankrolled himself. We don't know how much he paid for these. He hasn't disclosed that yet. But he is very focused on human spaceflight. He is an astronaut. He is very enthusiastic about human space efforts. But there are some concerns that have been raised. He is an investor in SpaceX, a private company. As my colleague at NPR, Jeff Brumfield, reported, he's also his company, Shift4 Payments, is the exclusive payment processor for SpaceX's Starlink program. So there are some concerns about conflict of interest there. You know, will all of these contracts go to SpaceX when he is the administrator there? There's also concerns that he may want to get rid of some of the big programs that are necessary for Artemis, like the SLS rocket. Those things are going to be quite difficult for administrator to get rid of because a lot of them are congressionally funded. But what we do know is we've got somebody who has been to space, who is a fan of space, and who has a personal investment in the private space industry that could be leading NASA into the future.
Can we say then that this human spaceflight, is that going to be the priority for NASA moving forward?
It is very likely it will. Again, this is all speculation. We don't know what Isaacman's plans are. He has not been confirmed, and we haven't heard from President-elect Trump's transition team about space. But we can think back to his first administration. That's the administration that actually put the Artemis program on a fast track with the timetables that we're on now. So we can make the assumption that the next Trump administration is also going to be human focused. Trump likes big, right? We know that. He likes big, he likes celebratory things. He is going to want to see humans land on the moon under his presidency. He is going to want to make big goals like sending humans to Mars in the next decade. So we can assume that Trump will put more resources and more focus into human space missions. Now, that also has other people concerned, other policy experts and scientists that, well, hey, if you're not going to get additional funding for these human programs, what's going to give? Are they going to cut some funding to science missions, telescopes, observatories, even climate change? NASA does a lot of climate monitoring, and we know that the Trump administration does not particularly like to talk about those things. So could funding be cut from those programs in order to make way for these big, boisterous, celebratory missions like landing humans on the moon? So again, it's all speculation. We'll see. A lot of this stuff is determined by Congress. So it's not the sole discretion of the president and the NASA administrator. Congress still has to, they are the purse strings, right? They still control the appropriations here. So we will see, but we will definitely see a greater focus on human spaceflight. That is one thing we can predict.
Central Florida Public Media's assistant news director and host of the podcast Are We There Yet?, Brendan Byrne. It's always a delight to have you on. Thank you.
So great to be here, Sharon.
While it is important to look forward to what lies ahead, as we approach the end of the year, we're taking time to reflect on 2024 and the work that was produced by the Central Florida Public Media Newsroom. We will take time to check in with our reporters and the impactful stories that moved them. Today, we're joined by Lillian Hernández Caraballo. She covers housing and homelessness for Central Florida Public Media as a Report for America Corps member. Lily, thanks for joining us today. Talk about the story that resonated the most with you this year.
The story that I feel was the most moving for me probably has to do with the Volusia County floods. When you look at my body of work for over the past year, I think I've written maybe 5 stories on this community by now, and I'm not done. It's just going to be something that you upkeep. To give you a quick rundown, in Volusia County, it's a coastal county on the east side of Florida, and they are going through, after years of development and rising waters that we have now, and climate change, whatever you want to say, things are stronger storms, right? There's just more rain now. Whatever you want to say is happening here, there is a convergence of factors that is causing a lot of these people to regularly live in water. Water comes into their homes like halfway to their walls. They can't drive in and out of their homes. And I'm not talking about something that lasts a few days and then you can just drive out and it's not the standing water. These people will go weeks, sometimes months, with water just at feet of water outside of their homes because of the way Volusia is shaped. This is happening mainly in rural Volusia. So we are talking farmers, workers, elderly, retired, poor people. We are talking people on fixed incomes, and it's causing major problems, especially when they have high property taxes on top of that, and then they have to deal with their insurance premiums and coverage. We're talking people who have put everything they have into buying a home in Volusia, just to find out now that the home will be underwater at least once a year. It's absolutely heartbreaking, and there's not a whole lot they can do. They're not in annexed city land. They can't go to city resources for this. They go to the county, and while the county has been trying to hear their concerns, not a whole lot is being offered to them in terms of maybe buying them out of their homes or just doing things infrastructurally to the county that could help them. So it's a very complicated, very nuanced issue that they don't really have a lot of recourse right now other than to live in water and deal with this all the time. So that was probably one of the most frustrating and impactful stories. And I think it's gotten a really good reception. And I think we've seen a lot of movement from government and other organizations since we started reporting on it.
Lily, what would you say came as a surprise to you during your reporting this year?
Probably the most surprising thing for me has been that the nonprofit sector, when it comes to helping people experiencing homelessness or people struggling with housing or just providing affordable housing, these nonprofits, while they do show and hold a united front when it comes to the big issues, they all work with each other. And I mean, they're absolutely wonderful people who believe in what they're doing and do their best. For what it's worth, these people, the funding is limited, right? When it comes to these organizations, they are not nationally funded, right? They're not federally funded or state funded. And they're certainly not under someone's pocket. They depend on donations, charities, volunteers, things like that. And when it comes to the funding, these nonprofits, I have found, are almost competing with each other for the funding available, for the attention of the public, the support. There's almost a bit of trying to pull to their own side so that they can perform this. And not only that, but how hard it is. I don't think the public understands how hard it is for these nonprofits to get money. And I think there's this general consensus now. Why donate to this charity? Is my money even going to the right place? What are they doing with the money? What do they need my money for? I'm broke too, and I get it, and we're all going through it, and it is what it is, kind of thing. But when it comes to the nonprofits, I have not ran into a lot of organizations that have as hard of a time to actually get even grants, like government grants. The grant writing process is usually very extensive and expensive. Sometimes these people are applying for grants for years before they finally have the federal or state government or somebody finally see them and recognize that they need money. And then when they do get money, it's honestly not that much, and they do a lot with this money. So I think that's been my biggest surprise. I don't know what I thought. I mean, I understand that nonprofits already had a hard time, but the biggest surprise was that there is a slight bit of a pull and a competition with each other. It's almost become a bit of an industry, if you will, the nonprofit industry and the housing and houselessness industry, if you will. There's a lot of money that there is to be had to be pulled, and they do wonders with these monies. They do a great job. But I would love to educate the public a little bit on how this works, how the competition works, how hard it is to get these grants, and where is this money going? Like, let's look into it. Let's be transparent. Let's account for every penny, and just really explain to people how that money process works when we are putting into housing and the well-being of our community.
Can you think of a voice, someone you spoke with, who really resonated and just captured the mission of your reporting?
Yes. So a lot of the people I speak to have kind of been through it. There have been a few that I believe are like you said, really encapsulated. A lot of them are going to be unhoused people or people who have been through homelessness. People who survived homelessness really have a different take on how it should be approached, and really have a lot of passion for it, and really have the lived experience, right? That expertise that you would need to even come up with solutions. So I think they're important voices to uplift and to put on a loudspeaker, because I don't know how much people are actually listening, right? And I have that platform to give them that. Kevin Lichtenberg, for example, is a man, he's known as the urban camper around downtown Orlando. He is currently unhoused and has been for about a couple of years on and off since the economy got super fun out there. But he works, right? So one of the things I try to do with my beat is that I try to show people the face of homelessness is changing. Whatever people have in mind, substance users, people with mental health issues, although that is absolutely happening and contributes the most to chronic homelessness, meaning people who are homeless for 5, 10, 20 years. It does happen, right? It does exist, and it does contribute to chronic homelessness. But most people who are homeless now in Central Florida just became homeless within the last year or two. And most of the people homeless in Central Florida right now are homeless, are experiencing homelessness for their very first time. And what people don't understand is that this is changing the face of homelessness. We are talking mainly about people on fixed incomes, elderly people, older women, very specifically, is the highest one that's up. Mothers, working parents, working people, people with full-time jobs. This is what I'm seeing in the street. This is what I'm trying to tell people. It's not far removed. Kevin Lichtenberg has a job. It's not a substance user. He uses his homelessness to basically camp, and he has excellent takes and really interesting ideas, such as, for example, the money that goes to nonprofits should maybe be going into some sort of a universal basic income directly to the homeless. The way he says it is, you give me money, I'll get a house, I'll open a business, I'll help the economy. Like, you're wasting more money just like making me have to find this money when it's all we need is that opportunity to come up with a deposit, with a rent, right? With a fix my credit and whatnot. So there's different situations for each one. Carolyn Carr, a single mother of 5 children in Melbourne, experiencing homelessness, living in their truck for a while, hitting up every single organization you can think of, just hustling, really going out there to do so much. And that hustle put her name out there, put people on her case, put her up on the list. She had to be made an emergency case. She wasn't supposed to be. There had to be a lot of exceptions done to get her into emergency housing. But then after that, she had to find her own place and landlords that would work with the Section 8. She was getting the emergency Section 8 vouchers. And she eventually was her hustle. And what she had to do and put up with, and the hours and the time that she would spend every day to become housed, was absolutely inspiring and really telling of what it takes with 5 children by yourself, staying in a shelter with a curfew just to get a roof over your head. Bettina Griscoviak experienced homelessness here in the United States. She's originally from Germany. She's used to social safety nets and then comes to the United States and sees there are none. After COVID, she saw there was a huge homelessness rise and no money or attention toward that population. So she took it upon herself to take them like food, peanut butter sandwiches. That small act has grown into what's now the Embrace organization. And she works and spends most of her time taking care of this community. So these are just a few people who have made a difference. Senator Osgood, the only politician I've ever heard of who openly admits to having experienced homelessness. She literally has a seat at the table in the Florida legislature. She is a voice for the homeless right now within the Florida legislature. I would say the only voice with lived experience. So we need more representation of these people, right? And for them to be heard more. And these are just some of the cases that have really encapsulated who is out there experiencing homelessness, who they are, who they can potentially be. And they're no different than you or me. So that's one of the main points of my mission reporting. And I think these people encapsulate it well.
Lillian Hernández Caraballo covers housing and homelessness for Central Florida Public Media as a Report for America Corps member. Lily, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, a UCF professor of folklore teaches us the origins of the typical and terrifying Christmas traditions. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. The Christmas season is full of celebratory traditions. There are some of the more obvious ones, like decorating the tree, giving gifts, hanging the stockings by the chimney with care. Then we have, ugly sweater parties, baking cookies, maybe binge watching holiday-themed movies. I'm guilty of that. But what about the tale of the Yule cat in Iceland, or the festive witch in Italy? And exactly when did Santa's scary counterpart Krampus join this party? We asked UCF Professor of Digital Media and Folklore, Natalie Underberg-Good, to join Engage to discuss some of these Christmas customs. We noted that most figures of Christmas lore had a similar MO. They judged children on the conduct for the year and either gave out gifts or punishment. I asked Underberg-Good why different cultures all came up with similar Christmas characters.
I think it has a lot to do with its function of trying to regulate children's behavior. So one of the main functions of folklore is kind of a reinforcement of cultural norms. And so there's a figure whose job it is to either, reward good behavior or either warn against or punish bad behavior. So whether it's Santa Claus or some of the other figures, that they have a function of saying, you've been good, here's your reward. You've been bad, here's your punishment. Sometimes it's the same figure, right, who does both things. And sometimes they're divided into two different creatures.
Okay, so this common thread of this character passing judgment for your conduct, I guess that's universally appealing.
Well, kids are universal.
Yeah. Nice. Well, let me start with the big guy. And just to be clear, if we have any kids listening, we know Santa is hard at work in the North Pole. But Santa St. Nick, how did that originate?
He's partially based on this Saint Nicholas, who was a 4th century saint. He was the bishop of Myra, so that's what's now Turkey. And you'll see him in iconography often in red robes, like he's wearing a long red robe. And there are a number of saints' legends attached to him. So he's known for being kind and generous. In one of his legends, for example, he's said to have saved these 3 daughters for being sold into prostitution by their father by secretly dropping sacks of gold coins into their windows at night, which sounds a little bit like dropping presents down a chimney, doesn't it? So that idea of giving kind gifts to somebody in need is something that's attached to his legend. And so the Dutch then brought this legend of Saint Nicholas, their Sinterklaas, to the US, to what is today New York. And they had the tradition of giving gifts to children on the Feast of Saint Nicholas, which is December 6th, which is when kids would get presents if they were good. So happy Feast of Saint Nicholas, right, on December 6th. So his counterpart was Father Christmas, kind of similar, but wearing a long robe. But our current image of Santa Claus has a lot to do with the work of a cartoonist named Thomas Nast. In the 19th century, he made a number of these illustrations of Santa Claus that really helped to solidify that image of what Santa looks like. And he was influenced in turn by "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," the poem from 1823, and that verbal, right, or that textual description of Santa. And then later, Santa developed more, thanks to Coca-Cola ads, actually, in the 1930s. Haddon Sundblom has, a very chubby, jolly Santa with a white beard. He's wearing a red suit, with the red hat and everything. And so that's kind of our current Santa Claus. I had a professor who I took a seminar about tradition, the sort of concept of tradition from, and he referred to Santa Claus as the patron saint of capitalism. And I think that makes sense.
Okay, let me ask you about this. There seems to be this rise in popularity in recent years. Krampus has just come to prominence, and that's a little bit on the darker side than Santa.
So Krampus is from German or Central European folklore and kind of part goat, part human. And I said earlier how this Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus character has a function of judging children or like encouraging good behavior. So Santa kind of discerns if you're good or bad, right? Well, Krampus is kind of the counterpart to Saint Nicholas. So Saint Nicholas would give you your presents, but Krampus would punish you if you were bad. So he's kind of the bad cop to Saint Nicholas's good cop. He has likely origins in pre-Christian winter solstice rituals. And with the spread of Christianity, that figure became attached to the Christmas in folk tradition, right? Not as an aspect of institutional Christianity. So he has his own night, Krampusnacht, which is the eve of the feast of Saint Nicholas. So in Catholic feast days, there's the feast day and there's the eve of the feast day, right after the sun goes down. So before the light comes up on St. Nicholas Day, there is this Krampusnacht. So he's prepared to, if you're not good, maybe hit you with a stick. And there are these events called Krampuslaufs, which are like runs. Lauf means run, and it's like kind of a parade in which people dress up as Krampus and parade through the streets and scaring people. It's scaring kids but also kind of delighting them maybe today. And so this has come with immigrants, like so many traditions, people who come to the United States bring their traditions with them. So Krampusnacht may have come here with immigrants, or it may have been something that people learned about in another way and then decided to recreate here. Krampus is the topic of a horror film in recent years, so it's kind of in the popular consciousness.
Another one I want to ask you about. I think fans of The Office are familiar with Belsnickel, but some people may be surprised to hear or know that that's a real part of German lore.
Yes, that's from Belsnickel or Pelsnickel from southern Germany. And that was brought to the US by the Pennsylvania Dutch, who, as you may know, are German because Deutsch means German. So he's kind of an interesting figure because we talked about how like Santa Claus says if you're good or bad, and whereas in other traditions you have, Saint Nick giving the good and Krampus giving the bad. Pelsnickel's another one that is kind of like Santa Claus in that he does the judging, but it's a little bit more of a scary figure perhaps than Santa. So he's bearded. He's kind of like this old fellow with that dirty face, and his clothes are tattered, and he carries like a sacklet slung over his shoulder, and he has a switch in his hand, right? So he's like Saint Nick and Krampus. So if you're good, you can get the goodies in his bag, cakes, candies, or nuts. So kids may have to like maybe answer questions or recite a Bible passage, show they're not like overly greedy and kind of eager to jump in there and gobble everything up. If they pass, they may get the gifts. If they're not, supposedly they'll get the switch. And he's different than Krampus because he's not like friendly looking like our Santa Claus, but he's clearly a human. He almost seems like those two things wrapped up together.
Are there any other Christmas tales for folklore that you think are super interesting that we might like to hear about that I didn't think to ask you about?
Well, some other things were like not figures so much, but
Okay.
more the question of light and the role of like light and warmth and solstice rituals. The winter solstice is obviously marks like the longest night of the year, right? So December 21st, it is the longest period of night before it starts getting lighter, the sun getting stronger, right? So that's kind of explains why things like wreaths, evergreens, candles are especially important components. Fire, things that represent new life, right, or the persistence of life throughout the cold and the dark. So Saturnalia, is an example of a winter solstice tradition. Originally December 17th, it went through December 23rd. So that Roman festival in the early church was kind of co-opted by the early Christian church to become what eventually became Christmas, right? Those same dates, because they were important dates in a Roman holiday, they became appropriate dates for Christmas holiday. And so throughout December, you have, more than one of these kinds of events that have to do with light, for example. So St. Lucy's Day in Scandinavia, which is December 13th. And St. Lucy's Day, actually, December 13th, rather, was the solstice in the old calendar. So when people follow the old Julian calendar. And so St. Lucy's Day, young women would dress up in a white dress and a red sash, and they wear a wreath of candles on their heads. So like the eldest daughter, that might be her job that day, right? She dresses up as St. Lucia. They also bake St. Lucia buns, these lucicats, which are supposed to resemble her eyes that are referred to in her saints legend. So I don't know if you know the legend of St. Lucy, but she's said to have either like plucked out her eyes or had her eyes gored out of her head. So one way, she's a martyr, right? So one way to look at it would be kind of being blinded, right? Like she's no longer able to see the light and is in darkness. So people share eye-formed buns with each other, and again, this idea of light is really important. So it's a Christian holiday, and it also appears to be pre-Christian in other ways.
Natalie Underberg-Good is professor and associate director of digital media and folklore in the UCF Nicholson School of Communication and Media. That is all for today's edition of Engage. We are back Thursday at 3. We'll look at Central Florida's Tales of Holiday Haunts and the Orlando group involved in sharing them. Just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you would like to hear more about, what you're glad you heard. You can send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. And if you missed any part of our show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen whenever it's convenient for you. The program will be available on demand at cfpublic.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for the company. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.